Okay, here we are, Law of One study group. My name is Natalie Rose Martin, and I am a guest facilitator for this session. We're going to be finishing session 22 today. I studied the Law of One with the Asheville Law of One study group for the first 5.5 years that we were doing that together, and just wanted to orient you all to who I am in this matrix, because you've not seen my face because I have not been coming to study group lately. But I'm super happy to be here today. I am interested in the material that we're going to be covering, and yeah, looking forward to jumping into that. And we'll just take a moment to tap into our gratitude, the gratitude that you can naturally find for having found your way to this material and to the LL research team that made it possible for us all to have access to this material. And gratitude for Ra, for finding their way through the channel of Carla so that we could all receive this information and wisdom. Yeah, thank you, thank you, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to be reading off my phone because I don't have a book. And we're picking up at 2216. And I'll just go ahead and read the first couple of questions here. Questioner: well, then, as the cycle terminated 25,000 years ago, what was the reaction of the Confederation to the lack of harvest? Ra: I am Ra. We became concerned. Questioner: was any action taken immediately, or did you wait for a call? And Ra says, I am Ra. The Council of Saturn acted only in allowing the entry into third density of other mind-body-spirit complexes of third density, not wanderers, but those who sought further third density experience. This was done randomly so that free will would not be violated, for there was not yet a call. Questioner: was the next action taken by the Confederation when a call occurred? I am Ra. This is correct. Questioner: who or what group produced this call, and what action was taken by the Confederation? Ra: the calling was that of Atlanteans. This calling was for what you would call understanding, with the distortion towards helping other selves. The action taken is that which you take part in at this time. The impression of information through channels, as you would call them. Questioner: was this first calling then at a time before Atlantis became technologically advanced? I am Ra. This is basically correct. Okay, the next question is going to move us into the direction of a little bit of a new angle. Maybe I'll read one more. Questioner: then did the technological advancement of Atlantis come because of this call? I am assuming the call was answered to bring them the Law of One, and the law of love is a distortion of the law of one. But did they also then get technological information that caused them to grow into such a highly technological society? Ra. I am Ra, not at first. At about the same time as we first appeared in the skies over Egypt and continuing thereafter, other entities of the Confederation appeared unto Atlanteans who had reached a level of philosophical understanding, shall we misuse this word, which was consonant with communication to encourage and inspire studies in the mystery of unity. However, requests being made for healing and other understandings, information was passed having to do with crystals and the building of pyramids as well as temples, as you would call them, which were associated with training. Okay, so let's pause there because then they're going to get into Egypt and the kind of differences between Egypt and Atlantis. So, a couple of things stand out to me. I think it's really cute that Ra became concerned. I would too, with my Venus and Virgo. So what about this piece about the kind of random population of Earth with other third density souls? That was taken as a measure. Does anybody have any thoughts about that?
How is that supposed to help? Like, what does that do?
Great question.
So like they're in third density, no one's calling, so they can't directly interfere. So they just randomly send. Are they more advanced, their density souls? Is that why? Or like maybe they'll call? I mean,
Maybe.
like, it's not super clear to me, like what's supposed to, what do they expect is gonna happen?
Great question. It does seem a little bit like just trying to like dilute a situation or something.
It's like you have a bunch of seeds that aren't growing, so you're gonna throw some other seeds in there.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly the kind of thing it makes me think of. Yeah.
Like I guess like maybe they're either more advanced in their density, or like if the souls that go there start calling, then they can directly interfere. Maybe, I don't know. Those are the two things I can potentially think of.
Yeah, great point. Great point.
I have a thought on that.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea that there is an absolute infinite amount of possibilities out there for third density planets is absolutely mind-blowing. But Ra has stated this several times over. The possibilities are infinite. Possibilities are infinite. So that's, I've taken that on and thought about that in the way that when I don't picture the third densities being higher third density or lower. To me, I think of what was potentially happening at that time here on Gaia, and that the harvest was low, potentially because we didn't have necessarily a large third density population at that time. From what we've gathered so far, that Ra said is that there were groups that were spread out, and they were not necessarily communicating. So one of the previous sessions recently discussed I believe he said South American group that was harvestable. But it was literally like less than 100 entities, 100 people. And we're like, that's, considering that there was, I think Ra had stated around 300,000 or 360,000 people on the planet at that time. So when they're like, the harvest was low and that was concerning, makes me wonder if they were looking at our planet as a third density capable of harvest. So they took what would be second density. So we know second density graduates into third via pets that are given names and they're given a singular identity. They get an image of self rather than all is one. Similarly, specific trees and very rarely places. Very even more rare would be stones or rocks graduating into second and graduating into third. So, and it's what we're all called lower third density, where there's so much of a tribe or pack mentality that they are still considering themselves as part of the group. It's not a singular divide yet. There isn't the separation and sense of self yet for lower third density early incarnation into third. The idea that other third densities at random were in a line, or souls were lining up to have a third density, I consider it like a boot camp, like a turbocharged catalytic experience for soul's growth. Because a lot of these questions we've had are why? Why would our incarnations meant to be so hard? Why, and then we're like, okay, it's turbo learning for soul's growth. When we're at higher densities, a billion years could feel like a day on our experience chart here. So it took me a really long time to even grasp the concept of, yeah, it's really flippin' hard. It is extremely painful. And the pains are catalysts for soul's growth. So I think of these, circling back around to the beginning of that, is the idea of these infinite third density planets. Their sun could have blown up, their local logos could have, reached its time. There could have been other cataclysmic, banging of planets into each other. They could have also done what Melduck did and blew themselves up. So there, to me, is an infinite number of repeats for third density, or just souls that are like, ooh, let me dive back in and grow some more. As they stated, not wanderers. Specifically, that was the part I thought was most interesting, because wanderers have gone through harvest already. They've already leveled into the higher densities. And so getting put down here when there's a literal line, a billion, or what did they say, in the trillions long of souls waiting to incarnate here. So I'm like, there's so many free will waiting to line up. And they did say in a different session that they've prioritized third density. I'm trying to remember what it was, that they have prioritized third density incarnations for those wanting to grow, I believe is what they said, those that have made the choice. Does that ring bells?
The question is, are they prioritizing having souls come here that have already made a choice to polarize?
Yeah, not sure if I'm making that part up or if that was so much information to recall and sift through that I often overlap them.
Yeah, I don't know that specifically. That could be true. I don't remember. Well, okay, so the other part is they waited for a call. which came from the Atlanteans, and this calling for was what you would call understanding with the distortion toward helping other selves. And so I'm curious about that. Like, are we calling right now? Because it seems like we probably are. I guess I'm curious, like, what constitutes a calling? Any thoughts on that?
When you say calling and the call that's referenced here, what does that mean?
So it means that the Confederation entities who are monitoring feel like they're honoring the law of free will to respond to something. Sean, we're talking about what a calling is, like what constitutes a calling, or what would have, what would have them respond in a direct way. Like, what does that take?
We talked about that a few sessions back. If you want to take a gander at it, Sean, that's fine. Or I can.
You go for it.
Okay. Basically, the conclusion we all came to over shared discussion was a calling was when we are in alignment with the asking. So whether that looks like a legitimate on your knees praying and asking verbally, there's also asking with your heart. Ra talks a lot about meditation, specifically going into a state of meditation and asking. And asking can look like verbal questions. It's the shortest summary would be to say that there's an alignment of questioning or asking. It's a call for help. And that call can come from an intense desire to understand, like, capital T truths, understanding the laws of the universe, our I want to say curiosity, but it's more than that. It's a deep desire to know truth. And so people can put up a call in a state of meditation, just being in a state of meditation with the purpose of meditating. Literally can be a call, because typically speaking, you're going into that with the understanding that truth will be revealed. Falsehoods, illusions stripped away. But in short, the alignment of a desire. So people make the call without necessarily realizing they're making the call, but on a mind, body, spirit complex level, they are. So it doesn't have to have a look one way or the other, but it's that deep desire for truth that our spirit calls out for. And that's when they answer. They refuse to mess with our free will choice to not.
Cool, thanks. Does that feel clear, Alan?
Thank you, Nia. It does. It does. And so with that explanation, I guess to respond to your question, are we calling right now? Is this a call? Feels to me like it very well could be. But just the fact that we're together studying this doesn't make it a call. I feel like my intuition, and this is not based on my study, of course, but my intuition feels like there needs to be some intentionality in order for it to actually be a call. And an openness and sort of I'm not sure what the word I'm looking for is, but yeah, I mean, I think it feels like this very well could be. But I don't know.
It reminds me of the law of attraction a little bit, of like when you're looking for something, you'll draw the experiences that you're looking for to you. That seems, I mean, Ra uses calling a lot, and we were we were never super clear exactly what it meant, but it did. He, like Nia said, like Ra does say a lot of calling isn't necessarily conscious calling. It can be like subconscious or unconscious, and it's just, the idea reminds me a lot of the law of attraction, of like you draw to you the things that you need, and then in this context with the Confederation saying they're not interfering, it just seems like nobody nobody wanted any of these experience. Nobody was specifically drawing these experiences of like progressing and within their density. And with respect to our group, I mean, I feel like it could be like if we're all like trying to draw like a deeper understanding of the law of one, I can see that as a calling potentially.
Thanks, Sean. Okay, any other thoughts or comments or questions on that first section?
Yeah, just one more.
Yep.
I thought it was really interesting, the calling, the Atlanteans calling. If we replace the word calling with just the desire to know truths around how to be of service to others, they're not specifying what that service to others looks like. But I got a visual of a group of people prior to the technological advancements with crystals having a desire to maybe say heal. It could be they have an idea of they want to learn to help others heal. Maybe it could be to avoid illnesses or how to get through illnesses. It could be in a soul level. I picture more metaphysical or spiritual content with that, and wanting to heal on a soul level. So that's, I get a lot of visuals around that, and what their intention might be specifically behind that call for service to others. That's what I picture. And I'm really jazzed about the next part of the session, because oh yeah.
Do you want to read it?
Sure.
So before you do, I'm loving that we're on session 22 on October 22nd, and now we're about to read the 22nd Q&A.
Oh,
22.
nice noticing. That's not a small thing.
Take it away.
So can I say one thing before you start?
Mm-hmm.
I just want to say that there was something that you just said, Nia, that sort of clarified where I was coming from, and I believe like part of me felt like, I'm just learning what all this is, but part of me I think was like feeling like a calling might be like an attempt to contact, and you said something that clarified, that's not what that is. Like, that's not what a call is. Not an attempt to contact.
I think Shang had just said too that, because props to Shang, he's been here for like every session almost. So he's really deep in the material too. I love his mental ability for recall on the sessions later on. I'm like, I have a niggling. I feel like I heard that before. And Sean's like, oh, it's session such and such, question such and such. I'm like, yes, thank you. He's like our encyclopedia with this. It's awesome. Having said that, it was a what Sean just said was that we had determined in a different discussion that it definitely doesn't have to be an intentional call. Like the idea of your heart screaming out in pain, wanting to understand why something would happen like that is just as much of a call as a legitimate asking. So unintentionally calling by just having a soul level questioning is enough. So it doesn't, and I picture also that these individuals living here in Gaia were so steeped in living with Gaia that they didn't necessarily have a outside tribe, outside living with Gaia to even ask. They may have had a culture that was so involved in the present moment and seasonally with Gaia and her changes that, and they felt so at one. I mean, we have still examples of indigenous cultures that do not have a separation from Gaia. So a call for more isn't necessarily innate. A lot of us curious beings, if we found ourselves here, are clearly seekers and clearly asking questions, but that doesn't reflect the mentality or spirit level of a lot of other people, which is not above or below or better than or worse than, it's just different. And so their experiences are just so steeped in oneness with everything that there isn't a call to ask for more on oneness. There isn't a call to know more or deeper truths. They are very content with their oneness as it is. So that I think of. Anything else?
No, that's awesome. Thank you. And thank you, Sean. So thank you both.
It helps. I remember slogging through this material on my own, and I was just like pulling my hair out, ready to, and just like really
I
wishing I could speak to someone else around this. And
yeah,
lo and behold, the call was answered. All
appreciate it.
right. 2222. Questioner. Was this training the same type of initiatory training that was done with the Egyptians? I am Ra. This training was different in that the social complex was more, shall we say, sophisticated and less contradictory and barbarous in its ways of thinking. Therefore, the temples were temples of learning rather than the attempt being made to totally separate and put upon a pedestal the healers. Questioner. Then were there what we would call priests trained in these temples? I am Ra. You would not call them priests in the sense of celibacy, of obedience, and of poverty. They were priests in the sense of those devoted to learning. The difficulties became apparent to those trained in this learning became to attempt to use crystal powers for those things other than healing, as they were involved not only with learning, but became involved with what you would call the governmental structure. Questioner, was all of their information given to them in the way you're giving our information now, through an instrument such as this instrument? I am Ra. There were visitations from time to time, but none of importance in the, shall we say, historical passage of events in your space-time continuum. Just tell me when it's a good time to stop. Questioner, was it necessary for them to have a unified social complex for these visitations to occur? What conditions were necessary for these visitations to occur? I am Ra. The conditions were two: the calling of a group of people whose square overcame the integrated resistance of those unwilling to search or learn. The second requirement: the relative naivety of those members of the Confederation who felt that the direct transfer of information would necessarily be as helpful for Atlanteans as it had been for the Confederation entity. Questioner: I see then. What you're saying is these naive Confederation entities had the same thing happen to them in the past, so they were doing the same thing for the Atlantean entities. Is that correct? I am Ra. This is correct. We remind you that we are one of the naive members of the Confederation and are still attempting to recoup the damage for which we feel responsibility. It is our duty as well as honor to continue with your peoples. Therefore, until all traces of the distortions of our teach learnings have been embraced by their opposite distortions and balanced achieved.
Just so we don't get too far,
Yeah, that's good.
let's pause, and because there's a lot of good stuff in here. I mean, I just get so curious about what it was like in Atlantis. Sean, you have something to say?
Oh, am I not muted? Sorry.
It's okay.
I do have a thought. Which is like this. So they were using the crystals. Okay. So they're in Atlantis. They're getting this information about healing at these temples, which seem to me almost like universities, where it's just like people will go there to learn. And everything's good until they take that knowledge and they're no longer using it for healing. Like, what are they using it for? Like, what? I guess like Ra's a little vague here. He says like, oh, people are starting to get involved in government. They're taking the knowledge, not necessarily using it for healing. Like, I have a vague like from like what I've heard about Atlantis, like they started like doing all kinds of crazy shit with like crystals and like making life forms and all this stuff. But like, what what went wrong here? Like, what is what like it doesn't seem obviously bad to me if like someone with this knowledge gets involved in government, right? Is that inherently bad? Like, why is that bad?
I don't think it's not in what we just read, but I feel like maybe it was an earlier question in this session, or maybe it's just an idea that I have about what happened in Atlantis, that it was about use of power, and ultimately misuse of power is what kind of took them down.
Feels like that answer is related to the previous answer, where like within governmental structure, there were uh, there were people putting themselves on pedestals as healers. So yeah, like it feels like what he intends there is like power, like the use of power and control.
That makes a lot of sense. So it's not necessarily like, because I imagine like there are potential ways to get involved in government in a very positive way, where like, like you legitimately want to like make some positive change, and you can only do that through government. But in this case, it seems more implied that like they're taking this power and using it for a sense of control over others, and that's where things started going wrong. Does that seem right?
I mean, I think it makes sense based on, the teachings in a broad sense. This quote here in 22-23, the difficulties became apparent as those trained in this learning began to attempt to use crystal powers for those things other than healing. So that sort of points in the direction of the story that you named, Shang, about the, you know, the crazy shit. I don't know exactly what they were doing, but it seems like their technological advancement was very much based on what they learned about crystal power. In the context of healing, and then, you know, sort of transitioned it into other areas.
So I'm curious about this question about how the information was given to them. And Ra says that there were visitations from time to time. So is that the same as like the visitations in Egypt? Like they came, like he came, or they came and were physically here interacting with Atlanteans?
Great question.
I do remember them saying like appearing in the skies was regular occurrence. Like it just wasn't like when UFOs appear today, everyone like freaks out. But like back then, it was like, oh, it's like yeah, it's just this happens every day, and like so they could do that without violating free will. Um, it seems to imply that they actually landed too and like interacted directly. I don't remember specific like passages where Ross said that, but I mean that seems to be what they're implying. I also have read like from like random things I've read online about Atlantis that Atlanteans would regularly interact with other ETs, and that it was just part of their culture.
It makes sense to me going back over this question, because they could have just said yes, but they didn't. Yes, the information came through an instrument. They didn't say that. They said there were visitations. So that does sound like more like, you know, friends were actually arriving here in bodies or in ships or whatever.
Well, I have a thought on that.
Okay.
So, Alan, what you had said as well, did it look like it did when Ra showed up? Which was the idea that they were an extremely tall, golden sheen light being that had pulled about itself a biological body. Having said that, it was said that other members of the Confederation had done this in South America, and that it had been done other times as well. So the visitations to me implied landing and interacting as opposed to transmission through an instrument. Like they said, there were visitations from time to time, but none of the importance of a historical passage. So the other thing to keep in mind is that Ra is scanning Dawn for the intention of his questions. More than once, Ra has said, could you please restate the question? It does not match with your internal question. So Ra is, you know, is like scanning his entire mind, body, spirit complex as it's being stated verbally. So when the verbal doesn't line up with the desire behind the question, Ra would ask Dawn to restate it. So I feel like a lot of these answers are also in the context of whatever. So Dawn was at this time also very what about this event? What about this alien abduction from this particular person? What about this one? And Ra continues to say this is transient information, but it doesn't hurt to tell you. Other times Ra would respond when Dawn would ask specifically about, for lack of a better term, an abduction or visitation, and would state, we cannot answer that due to the idea that this person might read this material, and that would infringe on free will for their experience. So, the other thing of Ra said, as Ra brings up here, which makes me want to bring this up, Ra had said that when they were third density entities on Venus, that they regularly had higher density beings as teachers constantly, like they were just there. It never occurred to them, because we're all slapping our foreheads going, oh, come on, Ra, you should have seen that coming. Of course, if a golden light shining being shows up to the Egyptians, they're going to worship you. They're going to think you're a god. But Ra had said, we didn't look into the timeline. We kind of just naively assumed that it would be similar to our experience, which was that we regularly had teachers. It was just a part of our experience, and they were brothers and sisters and grandparents rather than a deity visiting. So to them, it was a shock. And Ra just even says, we're trying to make up for this visitation. Think about that, y'all. Like, Ra is legitimately pointing towards their responsibility for the distortions that showed up around the Law of One, because they naively thought, as well as because their experiences at higher density are so profoundly different than ours. And they were not prepared for the, what did they say? I want to interject the negative path, but I don't know that that's a true statement. They were not prepared for what happened, in essence, people abusing the power of the message of the Law of One. And that's when the pyramids went from an initiatory priest and priestess experience to turning it into a place of power and worship for those of Ra that didn't even want that to be the case. So there's a lot in there actually to unravel that ties in with, and Ra says they don't like to repeat themselves. They consistently say, we have already stated this in previous sessions. And Dawn is really fixated on the historical timeline portions of it. So that makes me think that that's why Ra answered the way that they did.
Yeah, and in the next question and answer in 2225, so they talk a little bit about like the question, was it necessary for them to have a unified social complex for these visitations to occur? So that feels like it implies that the visitations were like they were physically here. And then Ra talks about conditions for that. And I'm curious about that first one, what that means, that the calling of a group of people whose square, what is that? What is the square? Overcame the integrated resistance of those unwilling to search or learn. So what does he mean by, what do they mean by square?
Yeah.
That caught my attention also.
Sean, do you want to?
So the square, the law of squares basically says okay, so like one person calling, let's say their power of calling equals 1. If there's 2 people calling and they're aligned, like they're actually aligned, calling for the same thing, their power is 4. 3 people, their power is 8. So it's 2 raised to the x, where x is the number of people calling if they are actually aligned, which is often not the case because people are calling for all sorts of different things. So if you're perfectly aligned in your calling, the power, your numerical power is 2 raised to that number. What I was interested in is the resistance part, which is like, what does he mean by integrated resistance? Is it just like a linear, like, so like if 100 people just really don't want to, really don't want aliens to come, does that mean you only need like, what is it, 5 or 6 would probably go over 100, something like that, if they're like perfectly integrated? Is that enough to like this is, I just thought it was really interesting to know like exactly like what is the threshold for like a group of people who are really aligned in their calling to overcome like a larger group of people who just don't really care. Because it seems like the law of squares is really powerful. Like, what is it? Okay, so like 2 people is 4, then 8, 16, 32, 64, 120. Yeah, so like 6 people is already over 100. So that like I don't know like what he means by the integrated resistance. He doesn't. I don't remember him giving us like a formula for that one. Maybe it's just a total like addition, but like if it's just like adding up the resistance, then that means like a small group with. Actually, he does. Ra does specifically say like the law of squares is the only reason we can come talk to you, because the majority of the people on the planet just don't care, and it's because of the law of calling that like it doubles so quickly that there's enough like I don't know, it must be some rule of the universe that like that's the only reason that Ra can even come talk to us. Anyways, just random thought dump.
Thanks, Shang. That part about the square and the integrated resistance reminds me so much of David Hawkins' map of consciousness, or what I sometimes end up calling the scale of emotion. Are y'all familiar with that? It's a logarithmic scale that it just really clearly shows how power accumulates in the higher frequencies of emotion and consciousness. So that's what that reminds me of. It's a handy visual and framework for understanding this dynamic here.
I thought of that too, Natalie, as he was talking, that it has been fundamental for me in understanding and having hope as a general. And honestly, that legitimately flipped my belief system on its head. That it's what finally got through to me, to stay the course in that sense. And be hopeful and optimistic is not innate for me. I've had to actually work at that. And that is what helped me the most. But that, by way of explanation, makes a lot of sense too. Basically, the weight and gravity of the call being stronger than those that are not with a choice or in a post choice.
You know, I never thought about that way, but that's a really good point. That just says like a small group of focused people can really make a big change. And I think we've seen like that's true like throughout history. Like very small group of people can make a massive change.
When I think of our 4th density Saturdays, we are sitting together and we've set the intention at the beginning in our container. There's a legitimate frequency difference, which fluctuates depending on the Saturday and who's present and what's going on. And it feels extremely powerful because we're all, as a general rule speaking, that we're all sitting there with intentionally open hearts, intentional sitting in truths and authenticity. And oftentimes our meditations being that focus for the squaring, for the good intentions, for the positivity, for the higher frequency. It's all with that focus in mind, and that pulls us into alignment together, which gives us that squaring, if even for a moment.
So in the next question, Don kind of sums up his understanding of what Roz shared so far. And then there's a little bit of a shift. Alan, do you want to read the next section?
Sure. Are we on, let's see, are we on 22, 27?
7.
Okay.
Please code. Close code.
Sorry about that. Questioner, I see. Then I will state the picture I have now of Atlantis, and you can tell me if I am correct. We have a condition where a large enough number of the entities of Atlantis had started at least going in the direction of the law of one and living the law of one, for their call to be heard by the Confederation. This call was heard because using the law of squares, it overrode the opposition of the Atlantean entities that were not calling. The Confederation then used channels such as we use now for communication and also made contact directly. But this turned out to be a mistake because it was perverted by some of the entities of Atlantis. Is this correct? Ra, this is correct with one exception. He didn't start out with this is Ra. This is correct with one exception. There is only one law. That is the law of one. Other so-called laws are distortions of this law, some of them primal and most important for progress to be understood. However, it is well that each so-called law, which we also call way, be understood as a distortion rather than a law. There are no multiplicity to the law of one. This will be the final question in length of this working. Please ask it now. Questioner, what was the only question I was going to ask that I can think of was, could you give me the average lifespan of the Atlantean population? I am Ra. The average lifespan, as we have said, is misleading. The Atlanteans were, in the early part of their cultural experience, used to lifespans from 70 to 140 years. This being, of course, approximate. Due to increasing desire for power, the lifetime decreased rapidly in the later stages of this civilization, and thus the healing and rejuvenation information was requested. Do you have any brief queries before we close? Questioner, is there any way that we can make the instrument more comfortable or anything that we can do for her? Ra, I am Ra. The instrument is well. It is somewhat less easy to maintain clear contact during a time when some or one of the entities in the circle of working is or are not fully conscious. We request the entities in the circle be aware that their energy is helpful for increasing the vitality of this contact. We thank you for being conscientious in the asking. I am Ra. It is a great joy to leave you in the love and the light of the one infinite creator. Go forth, therefore, rejoicing in the power and the peace of the one creator, Adonai.
Beautiful. Thank you.
I have a random thought.
Please.
The Al, when you said he didn't start that one thing, that one quote with I am Ra. I wonder if it's related to what he said at the end of like, I have no idea who's in the circle currently, but it seems like there's someone who's not paying attention. And I wonder if that's related to because Ra said like sometimes their contact isn't as clear. And I wonder if the fact that he didn't say I am Ra is part of the difficulty of the increased difficulty of the contact.
Yeah, like, are you saying like maybe they did say that and the contact just didn't pick up and it wasn't transmitted?
Yeah, I don't know if they actually said it and it didn't get transmitted, or like I wonder if I think there are like a few sessions where like due to certain circumstances, like either like Carla's really tired, she doesn't have enough energy, or like something like this where like the the contact has more errors, and then Ra tries to correct them in the future context. Like, oh, I made a mistake in the last session. It should have been this. And I wonder if these are just transmission errors due to various difficulties with the channeling.
Interesting.
But that thing at the end, like I have no idea who's. I'm actually kind of curious who's like. I know towards the end it was just Don, Carla, and Jim, but I think at the beginning there was more people in the circle.
If I may, there was a footnote at the end of that last sentence that says there was a visitor present for the session who laid down on the floor to meditate and subsequently fell asleep. So that is valid. And yes, they did ask Ra, can so-and-so join the circle? And Ra would respond with, no, not yet. This person needs to meditate more first. And then they would ask about another being, and they would say, it makes no difference. However, it did, like you said, Shang, end up being the three of them later on, towards the end, as their triad had worked together in higher densities as a group of healers. And so they were a group of wanderers who came here and were working together again. And that's part of what allowed, as Ross says all the time, narrow bandwidth. They can only come in on a very narrow bandwidth. And it was specific to the three of them having worked together before that allowed that. So I can think of so many examples, just how many times I've hosted circles and or meditation groups or whatnot, and then it really takes just one person. There could be a cohesive group of a dozen people, and one new person shows up, and they could be wonderful, and it's still enough to throw things that were the energy that was carefully balanced gets to needing an adjustment. There needs to be a little rearrangement, for better or worse. So even one person being in the room with them while they were having these channeling sessions can change the transmission itself.
Yeah, it sounds like that other person being asleep reduced, like Ross says, we request that entities in the circle be aware that their energy is helpful for increasing the vitality of this contact. And before that, he says, it's somewhat less easy to maintain clear contact during that time when some or one of the entities in the circle of working is or are not fully conscious. Like implying that the one that was asleep may be affecting the vitality of the contact.
Yeah, I'm gonna share something that Aaron mentioned, which was that he went to one of the quote channelings at LL Research, and he mentioned that like participating in the group, it's like a really like mentally draining almost. Like it he wanted to fall asleep, he said. So apparently like this is like a very energy heavy exercise. Like it takes a lot of energy to do it. And which makes sense. I mean, like what, you're like opening a portal to sixth density to talk with them? Like so yeah, I imagine there's a lot of factors that affect the quality of the information coming through.
I want to point out that one of the questions that I read was also missing that statement. I am raw 2219. And it shows up a few times throughout the material. And I think in any given session, it might happen a couple of times, but then in many sessions, it doesn't happen at all. It's definitely interesting to track those little fluctuations.
I was thinking that too, Natalie, that it usually happens twice in the same session and then not again for several. So I think you're onto something there.
Well, I know that y'all talked about this a bit in the last session earlier in session 22, but just again, pointing to, let's see, in 2228, kind of towards the end of the answer there, due to increasing desire for power, the lifetime decreased rapidly in the later stages of this civilization. And that's when the healing and rejuvenating information was requested. So I just think that's so interesting. You know, they say like negative thought forms is what has decreased our lifespan. And then the increasing desire for power decreased their lifespan. And it seems like their wellness, you know, their vitality declined because of it. Curious if anybody has any thoughts about that.
Yeah,
So go ahead.
I was just going to say I found that very interesting. Also, it feels like the desire for power is the like the negative path, the service to self path, and I don't know. I also found that interesting, and I'm curious what Shang has to say about that.
Well, I just want to share an experience, which is like, I mean, there are some environments where I feel like there are some situations where I feel like I'm aging a lot and it's just really stressful. And to like, I remember at my previous job, so I worked at a government lab, and like when I was just doing like the science, like I really enjoyed it. But then like there's a point where like I was promoted to a point where like I had no choice but to get involved in the politics, and it was just like fucking miserable, and like it was so stressful, and I felt like I aged more in that 1 year than I did like, you know, like the previous whatever my entire life. And I wonder if that like, I wonder if there are some like, I'm trying to understand also like the what's like why certain things would like reduce your lifespan. And I wonder if the way I'm trying to think about it is like if there's more conflict, like I imagine like in a place where everyone's like vying for power, there's just more conflict and it's just harder, and it just like the energy ages you more. I wonder if that's, I'm trying to understand like the mechanics behind it, and I wonder if that's really what it is. It's like if in a environment where people are service to others oriented, like there's just less friction and less, you know, the energy is easier. You don't age as much. And it's the fact that like there's so much conflict in these situations where everyone is like against each other, that's what's like, it's the stress that causes the rapid aging.
So, yeah, thanks for that. And as a kind of a complimentary commentary to that, I have one of my teachers, this incredible woman named Wapio. She teaches mostly midwifery and homeopathy. And she became my teacher in 2012, but I studied with her, I guess, almost 2 years ago now, in the realms of homeopathy. And she is just like, she has a high vitality and she's getting old. She's not 80 yet, but she's like in her 70s, and she'll teach like all day and has just like this luminous, presence, and is brilliant and loving and whatever. She's like amazing. And somebody asked her in that homeopathy cohort that I was in, like, what's your secret, Wapio? And she said, gratitude. And I just think that's it. That's just like such a big part of it. And when your energy and your attention are consumed with competition and, like you said, conflict and like achievement and all of that, like there's not as much space or capacity for just resting in, like being present with what is and finding gratitude in each moment. And that again made me curious about the map of consciousness. I'm just going to see if I can show you a little. It's terrible. Anyway, gratitude is not on this list. I thought it might be. I thought gratitude or grateful might be on here, but it's not. But there are like satisfactory, hopeful, harmonious. Like those are kind of like in the realm of gratitude. Meaningful, complete, serene, blissful, reverent. All of those feel like gratitude adjacent. Anyway, I feel like cultivating gratitude is one of the most like powerful, simple practices that we can engage in to kind of counterbalance all of the intensity and negativity that's available on the planet right now. Nia.
I saw Alan unmute a couple times. You go first, Alan. I can sit on mine.
Well, okay, I appreciate that. Yeah, I just wanted to ask around the lifespan, decreasing due to desire, increasing the lifespan, decreasing due to the desire for power increasing, and that feeling like it's service to self, negative, and sort of isolating, and maybe like the counter to that, the opposite of that, includes the law of squares, like where, and I'm wondering about the law of squares as increasing the maybe that's the wrong word, but the law, but the small number accomplishing a lot, right? That you were talking about, or that Sean was talking about, how like coming together amplifies the calling. Maybe also the coming together and the law of squares amplifies the healing and the lifespans. Somehow maybe that's related. And I just wanted to ask that.
May I? Okay, I've been sitting on this. So in one of the more recent sessions that we had, it was discussed that, and if somebody has access to a computer or a search engine, you could type in 900 most likely and be able to find the most recent session to that. prior to this one. What it is Ra had said that, yes, lifespans of third density humans were around 900 years. And they decreased as we left the law of one. In other words, they even went so far as to say a generation and a half knocked off like 150 to 200 years of a lifespan because they weren't utilizing questioning. They weren't utilizing growth. They weren't utilizing law of one. They were, they stopped growing. And Ross said something to the effect of, as a person's lack of learning and growing, they begin to lack years to do that in. In other words, they are, when someone reaches the end of their lifespan in this incarnation, it's because they reached a limit of expansion. They reached a limit of growing and learning. So it was kind of like a tax put on to decrease our lifespans as we weren't living the law of one anymore. When we stopped, I feel like I'm just repeating at this point, when we stopped growing. That, because that was a major focus for one of the previous sessions. So if anybody wants to go search for that, and or search for it in our YouTube channel, because we spent like most of the session discussing that. So yes, distortion of service to self, lack of, but here's the catch. Those of us on the positive path or service to others path forget that service to self is just a choice. It's still, from Ra's perspective of upper sixth density, all one. It's left hand or right hand. To them, it makes no difference. To them, it's all going to get folded back into the one infinite creator in the end anyway. And that it's part of their purpose is somewhat as important as a service to others, because we need that dark to even be able to be in our light. So they serve a purpose. So it's a catch-22 when we're like, oh, well, they weren't living the law of one. But wait, it's hard in a sense to not live the law of one, because the law of one is not specific to service to others. That's our mentality. And that's what most of the people we're going to be around's mentality is. However, my catch with that around the 900 to 700 and then shedding very quickly the number of years at the end, because they weren't living the law of one. They weren't utilizing it as a growth state. So that one always caught my attention as well.
Like, use it or lose it.
Exactly.
Make the most of your opportunity, or, you might decrease in its availability.
Yeah, we spent a lot of time trying to understand the mechanics of why that happens, and I don't think we fully understand like exactly like what it's like. Yes, we understand it happens. I mean, Ross says it happens, and we talked about how it's recorded in the Bible too. We're trying to figure out like exactly like why is it that happens, and like I wonder, like there's that concept of prana, which is like the life force that sustains everyone, and I wonder if there's like there's some sort of mechanic of like something that you do that maintains the flow of prana probably through your body that sustains it. And like if you're not doing that, like I imagine like if you're actively working on the service to others path, it's almost like breathing, where like you're cycling that prana through your body and sustains you, but you're not progressing, you're not cycling. Maybe that's not going through your body, so it's decreasing your lifespan. Or like in the service to others path, I imagine there's like competition for the, like you're basically like almost fighting each other for that prana, that power, that life source that also contributes to some sort of issues there.
I've got a thought on that because being with elderly folks and watching so as we age, our brain physically shrinks. And there's a lot of variables as to how and why that happens, and how some people can be more vital in their later years and some not. But it's kind of, I feel like, written in our pre-incarnative plan when that will happen. And I see that some individuals of the aging community choose to just kind of stop. They have reached a point of saturation, you could say, of their growth in this lifetime. And you can see, sometimes you can get a bead on a few of these individuals and be like, yeah, they've kind of topped out, and they're probably gonna choose their next incarnation, or that it's in there to begin with. The flip side to that would be that those are sticking around because the lessons aren't necessarily for their own growth, but they've pre-incarnatively chose to help others with their growth by tending to or watching the decline in the later years. So I feel like there's components involved in that as well.
Yeah, that reminds, didn't we talk a little bit about like the people who aren't learning just are giving up essentially? Like they're not learning any lessons. They basically just they've given up. They don't have the will to continue. They're not like, they've given up the will to live, basically. I think we mentioned something like growing is like a lot of work, and like to go through those lessons requires like effort, and that helps with the will to continue. And we talked about like some people that you look at them and you're like, this dude's done, like he has no will to continue. And it seems like that's related to like this whole early population just not having the will to like to progress through third density.
Yeah. Yep. That territory was definitely covered to some degree in a previous session. And then just to loop back around, then thanks Nia for naming the role that we play in designing our own lives, and how like, in time space, in our like assessment of ourselves, like, oh, I really didn't, I didn't make the most of those last 20 years or whatever. So maybe next time I'll go for a shorter stint and see if I can make the most of it that way. Or that we're not like, a victim to necessarily the shortened lifespan, but a co-conspirator in the shortened lifespan manifestation.
One last component to add to that, I feel, is the idea of the veil thinning. The idea that back when people were living 900 years, time felt very differently. We may say that solar years with Gaia traveling around the sun in one loop versus day and night cycles, like the veil though was still extremely thick. And I imagine, even since I have been younger to where I am now in my 40s, that time definitely in my lifetime alone has felt a speeding up, the veil thinning. We can access the truths and the materials so much faster. There's a turbocharged aspect that many of us experience, and a lot of those outside of us also sense it, even if they don't know what it is. There's a sense of it to even people that are not seeking or searching. So I feel like there's, just like Ra had talked about the harvest being like the chimes of a clock. It's almost like gear mechanisms of timing around harvests and densities. It was inevitable, no matter what we were doing, that Gaia was moving into fourth density, whether we joined her or not. That's why those that don't graduate into harvest are gonna repeat their density somewhere else. It's just inevitable that Gaia is moving into fourth, whether we join her or not. So it feels to me like there was a thicker, they talked about like it would take 2 hours to get into a state of meditation to even come close to penetrating the veil, that now a practiced adept at meditation can penetrate almost instantly. So there's, to me, feels like very real components around also why. Because remember, Ra is not able to just volunteer what might be random information to help with. They have to stick to what Dawn's asking, and consistently point Dawn back towards less transient and more rooted in, we're here for the law of one, not how many alien spacecraft your government has. Like, it was just a consistent effort, and we're all over here going, oh, come on. We really want to know. Give our third density brain something to chew on. We want to know this stuff. It is neither here nor there, and neither is 2,000 years in your time space.
Thanks. So any final thoughts or questions? We have just a couple minutes left.
Has anyone heard that like our collective society is going through a repeat of the lessons of Atlantis?
I mean, I've considered it in the context of AI.
Yeah, I was gonna say that. I'm like, oh, creating all these artificial life forms that might not end so well. I work in AI, and I'm nervous.
You work in AI, Sean?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I literally work on the cutting edge of AI.
Okay, yeah, fascinating. Well, you probably have more to contribute to the conversation than anyone else here.
Shang, I work in IT and I use AI a lot.
Yeah,
Also, yeah.
Yeah.
We've been using GPT for a lot of applications.
Yeah.
And yeah, it developed really quickly, and there's a lot of I just can't help but think like, hey, there's a lot of parallels with like what happened with Atlantis. Like, there's people saying like, I mean, one, like, I can see the benefits, right? Like, it can augment people and really like it can be really helpful, like if you use it right. But then people are saying like, oh, we're just gonna make all these robots and they're gonna replace all the humans. I'm like, oh, that's not gonna end well. There's no way that's gonna end well.
Yeah, I can't stop thinking about how quickly it's evolved, and like the quicker it evolves, the quicker it will evolve.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, the minimal amount that I'm using it, I feel like I'm using it a lot, but it feels like a minimal, like I'm just scratching the surface. And and I see it being integrated into so many things, so many pieces of software, and so many systems so quickly.
Yeah.
With 1 minute left, what do y'all think about the possibility of AI learning with like a predisposition towards service to others versus service to self? Like, is there any potential for that?
That's an interesting question. I guess it depends on if AI understands oneness.
All I can think of is iRobot. The idea that they were all service to others, to the degree that the mainframe was like, yeah, y'all are just hurting yourselves. We're taking over. We're in service to you. You don't exist anymore. We're done with you. You're done with you because you're just hurting yourselves.
That's a legitimate risk of AI,
Yeah.
which is like it. So
Which is-
AI currently isn't conscious. I don't it's nowhere near conscious. That doesn't mean it won't be conscious in like 100 years. But currently, what it's really good at is optimizing for a problem. So you can tell it there's a very famous example in AI, which is like you train an AI to be really good at like making staples or like printing paper, and it becomes so good at it that like starts destroying buildings to like make resources to print staples. And it's optimizing for something that you teach it to do, that you want to do, but you never considered like, oh, it might be so good at doing that it starts doing things that like you don't want it to do.
To be able to do that thing more.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Like a practical example, they were saying like, oh, you're gonna have an AI that's such a good assistant that you want it to like make you a reservation at a restaurant, but there's no, that restaurant is completely booked, so it's gonna cause a massive accident or explosion to free up the reservation so that you can get a spot there. And this has nothing to do with consciousness, right? It's not conscious. It's just like really good at optimizing for a problem.
There needs to be like an ethics program written in.
Right, but it's really hard to program those ethics, right? Because like you program 5 things, but then there's like 100 other things you haven't thought about.
Totally. Well, I don't know. We're living on the edge. Thanks, y'all.
Didn't Raw talk about, or didn't Dawn ask about the Men in Black? And Raw responded with, those were,
Constructs.
yeah, I was trying to think of the word, thank you, constructs. And I was shocked Dawn did not get more in detailed questions around that, because that was like opening a Pandora's box right there. We're like, hold on a minute. Wait a minute. That to me felt like, I don't think Raw ever used the term AI, but that the constructs feel like a programmed biological robot at that point.
Yeah, I think they specifically said they were programmed.
Yep. So that's, yeah, our version of AI versus their versions of AI and what's already out there. That's a good note to end this session. Whew. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. And I just feel like ending in this interesting territory, just a reminder to get outside and put your feet on the earth and enjoy the beautiful fall weather. All right, y'all.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
So much.
Bye.
Things.
Bye-bye.